And I know I'm probably on your memo saying I'm talking about how elections are rigged and manipulated, which they are. And I covered that for about 10 months. But I think when we think about elections, we always think that rigging and manipulation can happen just at the ballot box or just through registration and things like that. But one of the ways that election manipulation happens is through the media. And I say that because when people go out and vote, they vote based on what they think they know. And where do you get your information from? You read it, you watch it, you hear it. And what we have seen over the past 4 years is that our media has gone from supposed, truth-seeking journalists who only care about the truth to propagandists for the Democratic Party. So I want to talk about that in particular to Donald Trump winning a second term. So I know for me, I felt like there has just been a new sense of glory these past 2 weeks with Donald Trump in office. Things feel good. And I can't help but remind myself, yes, it's something to clap about. I can't help but remind myself that he's in the White House and things are glorious after he went through trials and tribulations and assassination attempts, and they tried to throw him in jail. And if you look at all of those different things, they all have one thing in common, and that is how the media depicted every single thing. Okay, so I want to start off, for a long time, Americans thought that journalists were these great people, that they woke up every morning and they were just looking for the truth. It didn't matter if it was the truth about Republicans or Democrats. And for a time, truth-seeking journalists held the government accountable. You expected them to uncover some serious dirt, and they did that, for sure. And what we've seen over the past few years is that we no longer have these truth-seeking journalists. We have propagandists, and we have Democratic spokespersons masquerading as journalists and expecting the American public to be okay with that and to be okay with answering to these journalists, including Republicans who willingly get on all of these left-wing networks and take the most ridiculous gotcha questions and pretend like they're doing something that they should be doing. You do not have to answer to the propaganda press. You do not have to explain common sense, moderate positions to the propaganda press. So some of those things that I want to talk about that are moderate positions and common sense is that President Joe Biden should not have remained in office up until January 20th. And yeah. And the reason he did is because the media was interfering in the election. We all saw the same evidence. We saw Joe Biden freezing on stage and being dragged off by Obama. We saw Joe Biden falling both up and down the stairs. We also saw Joe Biden saying that America is just, and everyone's like, that's beautiful. Like, that's our president right there. And unfortunately, if you said that, though, as a conservative, you were smeared. You were maligned. And your character was defamed. I would know that because I work in conservative media, and I've been called a right-wing conspiracy theorist for a good 10 months. I'm going to end up getting a tattoo to my face. But I want to go over some of the headlines we saw. CNN had Oliver Darcy at the time. Days before Donald Trump and Joe Biden had their only debate, he writes, right-wing media figures are desperately pushing conspiracy theories about Biden ahead of the debate. And what were those conspiracy theories? That he is a senile, mentally incapacitated elderly man who cannot remember what he had for breakfast, let alone run the federal government. We also know he couldn't remember when his son died. We also know that he couldn't remember what he was supposed to say. And we also know from recent reporting he would call up he would call up Democratic officials and forget why he called them. But remember, you were a conspiracy theorist if you thought that was true. And of course, like all good conspiracy theories, if you give it, 6 months to a year, they come true. You're always actually right. And the Wall Street Journal, they came out with a report just a few weeks ago, and they talked about how the White House and Democratic aides worked to conceal Biden's cognitive and physical decline. They limited Biden's interactions with members of his own party. In fact, members of his cabinet. I'm sure, honestly, and I give Joe Biden a pass for this one, he probably didn't know Lloyd Austin wasn't there because we didn't know either. But that's just how limited interactions he had with his cabinet that he had no idea this man was getting surgery for weeks, okay? Other aides worried that Joe Biden was delegating his duties to too many administration officials, even though they thought, Biden was the guy that got 81 million votes. Maybe he should do the job he was elected for, right? And all of these concerns, according to the Wall Street Journal, they didn't just happen in the last 5 months of Joe Biden's presidency or candidacy. They began the first few months of his first year in office. That is 4 years ago. There were these signs. But again, that can't be true because the propaganda press, which is how I'm going to refer to the left-wing media from now on, decided that they were going to conceal everything. They were going to engage in one of the biggest scandals in the past century, and that is covering up the sitting president whose finger could be on that nuclear trigger. They were going to cover up his decline. The Independent's Noah Berlatsky wrote, "Let's fact-check so-called Biden's mental decline," and contended that questions about Biden's fitness aren't being made in good faith. Yes, how dare us Republicans care that our president might send us into a war, might open the border even more, because he was mentally incapacitated, right? We have The Guardian, Nick Robbins-Early. He tried to downplay the concerns as just a fixture of conservative media, because we had nothing better to do, of course, okay? And that too much of the narrative has relied on allegations or outright deception. Yes, we were deceiving you when Joe Biden was falling up and down the stairs. That was just all of us working together. Then you had NBC News in October of 2023. Republicans are floating the quiet conspiracy that Biden will not be on the ballot. That turned out very well, obviously. But again, if you dared to say these things, you were branded as a conspiracy theorist. In fact, it's become a badge of honor. If you aren't called a conspiracy theorist, you're probably too far left to be here, right? And now that the election is over, you see the Wall Street Journal come out. We saw the New York Times come out with a very similar report, and they basically detail how Biden was never fit to run for office, let alone remain in the office of the presidency, right? And it's like, wow, guys, like excellent journalism, 4 years too late. And you say to yourself, okay, they've known these Democratic officials for years. They are in each other's pockets. They have dinner with each other as soon as a press briefing ends, these journalists and these politicians. So why didn't they write it over the past 4 years? They certainly had access. They have the most resources in the world. They have millions of dollars, plenty of camera crews, the whole nine. It's because they didn't want to, because they are working as propagandists. Their sole job is to create fodder for Democrats, right? Whether it's through covering up for Biden, spreading, allegations, unsubstantiated allegations, whether it's perpetuating hoaxes about, Russia collusion and what have you. And unfortunately for the American people, all of these so-called journalists lost their appetite for accountability when Americans needed them most. And luckily for Americans, we had Elon Musk biax, right? Where you couldn't have censorship. We had conservative media outlets like myself at The Federalist, plenty of others who were doing the work that every journalist should have been doing but didn't. Now, the propaganda press was given a second chance at redemption in 2024, and that is when Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee. And the reason I say that is because there was so much they could have covered. This was such an easy layup. They could have said, hey, Kamala, you dropped out in 2020 with less than 2% of the vote. What makes you think you're good this go around? They could have said, hey, you're one of the most unpopular vice presidents in history. How are you going to turn that around in about 4 months? They could have said, hey, you were involved in ousting your boss in a coup. Did you just notice his cognitive decline, or did you keep quiet about it for 4 years? Because either way, that makes her unqualified to be president. But they didn't ask her about that, no. Instead, they told us that she was this beautiful woman. She was the most qualified candidate behind Hillary Clinton, of course. And she had a great laugh. That cackle really just was beautiful. And so what the media did instead, unsurprisingly, is they doubled down. They went into overdrive to cover up for Kamala Harris. And the first way they did this is through deceptive coverage. So Media Research Center did a poll in August. This is just a few weeks after we know that she's the presumptive nominee. And more than 70% of Democrats and independents who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 had no idea what Kamala's positions were. And they didn't really seem to care. They had no idea that in 2020 she supported a bail fund to let violent rioters out. They had no idea that in 2019 she was voted the most liberal senator. They had no idea. And why didn't they have an idea? They went to CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, and NBC for their news. Those truth-telling journalists really did their job really, really well. And rather than having wall-to-wall coverage that the sitting vice president and possibly future president had no policy proposals for weeks out there, the mainstream media actually just went, oh, I'm going to pretend I didn't see that. And the thing is, we know they could have done that because when it came time to work for the Democrats in July to oust Joe Biden, we had wall-to-wall coverage about how Joe Biden was not fit at all. How could anyone in their right mind think Joe Biden could be president? But when it came to having that same appetite for accountability that they had for 2 weeks, they lost it in August, unsurprisingly. In fact, during an episode of the New York Times The Daily podcast, their reporter Astrid Herndon laughed when he was asked what a Harris administration would look like. And he says, we don't know what type of president she would be. And frankly, if you ask any Democrat, they would say that's tomorrow's problem. As long as she wins the election and stops Donald Trump, they don't care. Look, you expect the Democrats not to care. They want their person to win, right? That's unsurprising. But a functioning media should care about these things. That would be like the biggest story. Hey, we've asked Kamala 20 times and she won't answer. But they didn't do it. They refused to put public pressure on her to sit down for an interview or answer questions off the cuff. They didn't ask her how she would fix the problems that her administration created. They were giving her tongue baths every single interview she did. And by every single interview, I mean what, like the 5 interviews she did with friendly press, mind you? And another thing that they did, and this was a big one for us at least, back in 2004, I don't know if you guys remember Dan Rather, he left CBS News voluntarily. His producer got fired because he put out a essential hit piece in October about Bush. And the reason he got in trouble for that, and there was an independent panel that was hired to investigate this, is it relied on false documents. So at a point in time, it was career suicide to use deceptive material to basically try and harm another candidate or to boost another candidate. And in 2024, that became standard editorial practice. So I don't know how many of you saw, I think it was Sunday night, CBS releases an interview question in which Kamala tries to explain why no one around the world takes her seriously, her administration. And it was like the worst answer you could have imagined. And you think, wow, maybe she didn't get like media prep. And then 24 hours later, the full interview comes out, and she has this amazing answer. It is so strong, and you're like, wow, like, that's amazing. And of course, it turns out it wasn't the answer. They sliced and diced it and put it together to make her sound good. The CBS News executive sat back and thought, this is a good idea. We should interfere for this candidate by making her sound better than she is. That should be career suicide, but it wasn't. Because CBS News clearly, and I respect this for them, they don't view themselves as journalists anymore then. They really do believe that they are just propagandists and shills, and they're doing their job great if that's the case, right? Let's see. Then we have, of course, and I want to switch gears to Donald Trump, because the reason that the propaganda press had to work overtime to help Kamala Harris and Joe Biden is because Donald Trump simply could not be stopped, even when an assassin tried to take Donald Trump out, not just once, but twice, really. And it's really notable how the assassination was covered. I remember when it happened, I was on phone with friends, and I was freaking out. I couldn't even enjoy my one night out with my girlfriends. I was like, guys, not tonight, not tonight. And meanwhile, you had the mainstream media. They were trying to dismiss it as just an incident or a shooting in which Donald Trump claims he was shot. So for years, the left painted Donald Trump, Hitler, threat to democracy, a fascist, the whole nine. And all of this language is what we should call assassination prep language. It is meant to invoke and justify the most egregious acts of political violence so that when that political violence does happen, nobody bats an eye. And so many people didn't. So last November, the Washington Post wrote, "A Trump dictatorship is increasingly inevitable." The average American, when they hear dictatorship, they get scared, and rightfully so, and they think, oh God, like something needs to happen, right? You're trying to invoke that spirit in them. Barring some miracle, Trump will soon be the presumptive Republican nominee for president. What would that miracle be? When that happens, there will be a swift and dramatic shift in the political power dynamic in his favor, and then he went on to compare Trump and his supporters to Nazis, okay? Then he asks an ominous question. He says, can Trump win this election? Unless something radical and unforeseen happens, of course he can. Radical and unforeseen, what, I don't know, missing an assassin's bullet by half an inch. The Atlantic's Rod Brownstein said that Trump's second term would create the greatest threat to the nation since the Civil War. Yes, Donald Trump would be more threatening, if not the same, as the Civil War. The Hill, Jacob Ware, he tried to lessen the blow last January, saying that assassination attempts are on the rise worldwide. Will the United States be next? All of these outlets went through great extent to try and not only dehumanize Donald Trump as Hitler and a Nazi and the whole nine, but try to desensitize you to possible acts of political violence, right? And then, when Donald Trump was nearly assassinated, we got from the Denver Post a photo of Donald Trump. He was, pumping his fist in the air, and they captioned it, "Gunman dies in attack. Trump says he was shot in the air." Yes, that poor gunman. Do you see how easy, though, it was for them to dismiss political violence? And there wasn't enough backlash to the Denver Post doing it because people said, I mean, he is Hitler, He is that guy. Then you had the second assassination attempt that occurred when he was in his West Palm Beach golf course. And within hours of that one, you had Lester Holt from NBC saying that today's apparent assassination attempt comes amid increasingly fierce rhetoric on the campaign trail itself. Mr. Trump continues to make baseless claims about Haitian immigrants in Ohio, and there were new bomb threats in town this weekend. Yes, apparently Donald Trump was almost assassinated for bomb threats, except the bomb threats were all hoaxes. All 33 bomb threats were hoaxes. But the mainstream left-wing propaganda press jumped to conclusions to try and say, like, yeah, Donald Trump was almost assassinated, but he almost got Ohio bombed. They were trying to justify political violence in some capacity. Why would they do this? You have to ask yourself that. Because they're trying to drag their preferred candidate across the finish line. And that preferred candidate was Harris. If you can make Donald Trump seem like a violent threat to America, you're going to turn some voters off, undoubtedly. And that's why I say the media is involved in interfering in the elections. Because if you only read NBC, CNN, the whole line, you would end up thinking that Donald Trump is Hitler, that he is involved in bombing America, and that he's going to turn America into, America in 1865, where everyone's fighting. That is not the only way that elections are rigged and manipulated, so I'm going to touch on this really quick, Jason. I did cover election integrity for Georgia in particular, and one of the biggest issues that we faced is that election officials were told they must certify an election. No questions asked. Even if, for instance, there were more votes cast than voters who voted. And if you didn't want to do that, you were smeared as a right-wing conspiracy theorist, as a nut job, as a fringe, right? The whole nine. And that was the media doing it. They said that you had to cede your right to question a government-run election, as if our government has never meddled in foreign elections, but they would stop here domestically, of course. They're not going to do that to their fellow people. Then, of course, the SAVE Act was a huge deal this year. Let's not have illegal immigrants getting on the voter rolls, because let's require documentary proof of citizenship. And what the media did is said, but illegal immigrant voting is so rare. Like, why would we need that? And it's like, you know what else is like rare and illegal? Driving drunk. How many people die every year because they're hit by a drunk driver? Quite a few, right? And so all of that goes to say, the media's involvement in interfering in elections is numerous. I didn't even cover all of it. And you shouldn't trust mainstream media. I hope everybody walks away tonight and they watch conservative media, read conservative outlets. And John, I hate to do this to you because I know you've been called upon a few times, but I do want to give a shout out to John because John was directing election integrity. And there have been so many instances this past election cycle where I would call him up, freaking out. I'd be like, John, I don't understand what's going on. He walked me through everything. And it's because John was able to walk me through it that I was able to do reporting. And John was able to walk me through it because John was making sure that our elections were safe and secure. I was doing it on the media end, trying to protect our elections from that end. John was doing it by making sure that ballot boxes were safe, that people were registering safely, that we had boots on the ground. And John could have taken a role at the White House. He would have done a great job at the White House. But John has stayed on with the RNC as chief of staff for the co-chair, and he's going to continue the fight for election integrity. And so for that, we're very thankful, John.